Hi everyone, it's Kathy. Thank you so much for joining me. Today I'll be sharing how I created this card using the new stained glass window die set as well as the FaDoodle holly stamp set. I started out by die cutting a piece of vellum using the stained glass window die set, and then I made sure to treat it really well with an anti-static powder bag because I'm going to be doing some heat embossing on the vellum. Next, I stamped the holly with a gold pigment ink pad, and I just randomly stamped all over my little window and made sure to stamp off the edge just to give it that more organic feel. Once I was done with the stamping, I coated my panel with some gold embossing powder, and then I used my heat tool to set the embossing powder. I did have my heat tool heating up off to the side so it would be nice and hot to melt the powder quickly, because I didn't want to scorch the vellum, and I also wanted to try to minimize warping of the vellum. After I had embossed the panel, I flipped it over so that the embossed side is face down onto a piece of scratch paper, and I used a piece of removable tape just to hold my panel in place while I color in my holly leaves. I was about to start coloring in my holly leaves with peeled paint Distress Oxide ink, and then I remembered that I wanted to add just a tiny little bit of shading down the center of each of the holly leaves. So I put the peeled paint Distress Oxide ink off to the side, and I grabbed my Forest Moss Distress Oxide ink, and I just dipped the tip of a Q-tip into the ink pad and drew that line down the center of each of the holly leaves. I still had peeled paint ink on the other end of my Q-tip, so I just flipped that over to finish coloring in the leaves. One thing about this particular technique is you do want to remember to color on the back side of your vellum, and I have found that pigment ink or Distress Oxide inks work best for this technique. It does take some time for the ink to dry, but if you're patient, it will eventually dry. Another tip is if you do want to add a little bit of shading or darkness, make sure you start with that color first. I really didn't give the Forest Moss ink a chance to dry completely before I came in with the peeled paint, so I did lose some of that shading. But if you want to keep that shading, go ahead and let that first layer of ink dry completely before coming in with the second color. Anyway, moving right along, I continued and colored in all of my holly leaves and holly berries. And once I was done with that, I did set the panel aside so that the ink could dry completely before moving on to the next step. I wanted to have a snowy background behind my holly. So again, I turned it face down. So again, I'm working on the back side of the vellum. And then I laid the polka dot stencil on top and used an ink blending tool with a white ink pad on the back side. While I was doing this, I made sure to pounce my ink blending tool rather than go in a circular motion, because I didn't want to move the previous layers of ink that were already on the holly and the holly berries. After I had added in my little snow dots, I grabbed 2 of the dies from the stained glass window die set to create a frame, and I ran that through my die cut machine using white cardstock. I wanted my frame to be a shiny gold, so I used my gold pigment ink pad and dragged it around the frame that I had die cut. Once the frame was coated with the gold ink, I sprinkled gold embossing powder over the entire frame. And again, I had my heat tool heating up off to the side, and then I just used that to set the embossing powder to make my frame nice and shiny. Next, I wanted to work on my background, so I inked up the Farmhouse Shiplap background stamp with pumice stone Distress Oxide ink, and I placed my top folding A2 size note card right on top of that stamp. Grabbed a piece of scratch paper so I could rub over that card base to make sure that I got a nice transfer of ink. And once I was done with that, it was time to put my card together. I cut a piece of light blue cardstock using the same size stained glass window die to go behind my vellum, just to add a little bit of color behind my stamped and colored panel. I used liquid glue to adhere my gold embossed frame to the vellum panel. Then I used liquid glue on the outer edges of the vellum panel And then I used a tiny little bit of adhesive from a tape runner on the back of the colored holly leaves. And when you do that, you want to make sure that the adhesive is on areas that you colored so that it doesn't show through the vellum. I placed that on top of the blue panel that I had die cut. Off camera, I had stamped and embossed the words Christmas Wishes from the FaDoodle Holly stamp set. And I just cut them down in kind of tiny wonky sentiment strips, and I adhered those using liquid glue onto little scraps of gold glitter cardstock that I had in my stash. I used liquid glue to adhere my little sentiment strips to my stained glass window, and when I adhered them to the stained glass panel, I wanted them to be a little bit wonky, so I didn't try to get them perfectly straight. Once I had my little sentiment strips adhered to my stained glass panel, I used my tape runner to adhere my stained glass window to the front of my card. And that's it. That finishes up my card for today. Thank you so much for joining me. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. If you've not yet subscribed, we'd love it if you would. And don't forget to ring the bell so you're notified every time a new video is posted. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time.